Welcome to the deep dive. You guys are really diving into a tricky one this time, climate change.
Yeah.
And that whole debate about who's responsible, developing nations, it's a big one. Luckily, we've got a ton of your research right here, articles, reports, ready to dig in.
It's a debate that can quickly get, well, messy. Lots of finger pointing. Hopefully, by the time we're done with this deep dive, you'll come away with a clearer understanding of all sides and maybe, just maybe, some fresh ideas of your own.
Love that. Okay, so one of the first things that jumps out from all this research is this tension between historical responsibility and current emissions. It's like, when you're looking at a family photo album. You can't just ignore who was taking up the most space in those early pictures.
Right.
And in this case, you're talking about the developed world, the U.S., the European Union. Historically, they were the ones emitting the most by a landslide. And here's the thing. Those emissions don't just vanish. They stick around.
Yeah.
In the atmosphere, contributing to this whole climate change problem. So it's like they racked up this carbon debt, and now the rest of the world's being asked to pay it off.
That's one way to look at it, and it's a major sticking point in these climate negotiations. Developing nations are saying, hold on, you want us to limit our growth, our emissions? When we're still dealing with poverty, you guys got to develop, pollute without any real restrictions.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Because on the flip side, the research also points out that today, it's countries like China and India that are some of the biggest emitters. So how do you balance those two things, past responsibility versus what's happening right now?
That's where you get into this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. It's a big part of the Paris Agreement, actually. And it boils down to this. Yeah, every country has a part to play, but those parts, they shouldn't be equal. Richer nations, the developed ones, they need to be leading the charge, cutting their emissions. And crucially, providing financial help to support developing countries in making the switch to cleaner energy and adapting to, well, the changes that are already happening because of climate change.
And speaking of financial help, you flagged something about a $100 billion pledge in here. What's the deal with that?
Ah, yes. The $100 billion promise. Basically, back in 2009, developed countries pledged to give $100 billion every year by 2020 to developing countries to help them tackle this whole climate change thing. But, and your research points this out, they haven't exactly kept that promise. It's a big source of frustration, distrust for these developing countries.
Yeah, I can see why. It's like, imagine being told to clean up this mess you didn't make and then being denied the resources you were promised to help with the cleanup. Infuriating.
It highlights a serious power imbalance, right? Developing nations feel like they're constantly being asked to make sacrifices without the same level of support or accountability for what's happened in the past.
So, if developed countries are dragging their feet on this financial stuff, how does that impact these big international agreements, like the Paris Agreement? I see that pop up a lot in the articles you sent.
That's the question, isn't it? The Paris Agreement, you have to give it credit. It was huge, getting pretty much every country on board with a plan for climate action. But as your research points out, it's kind of like a referee who shows up without a whistle.
You mean there's no way to really enforce it?
Right. It all hinges on these things called nationally determined contributions, NDCs for short. Basically, countries set their own goals, their own timelines for cutting emissions.
Okay, so NDCs. Break that down for me. What are they exactly and why are they such a big deal?
Imagine each country comes up with its own recipe for shrinking its carbon footprint, right? They decide what goes in. Renewable energy investments, okay, that's one ingredient. Improving how they manage their forests, another one. They decide how much of each thing they want to use. Those are their NDCs, their own unique plan to tackle climate change.
Makes sense. But it seems like it leaves a lot of wiggle room for interpretation, maybe even some loopholes, right?
Oh. Exactly. You got it. That's one of the biggest criticisms of the Paris Agreement. Sure, it gives you a framework, but it doesn't actually make sure the actions are going to be enough to meet that goal of keeping warming below 2 degrees, or even better, 1.5 degrees, compared to those pre-industrial levels.
And the research you sent, it suggests that the pledges countries are making right now, they're not even close to hitting those targets.
Yeah, unfortunately not. Even if every country did everything they promised, we're still looking at a lot more warming. And that's a recipe for disaster. Plus, there's no global system to penalize countries if they don't meet their goals. It all boils down to peer pressure, a sense of shared responsibility, that kind of thing.
Which, based on that whole $100 billion pledge situation, doesn't exactly inspire confidence.
Right, and that's why some experts are saying we need some fresh thinking when it comes to this global climate governance stuff, stronger enforcement, like maybe carbon tariffs on imports from countries that aren't keeping their promises, or how about rewarding countries that go above and beyond? Create a system where doing good actually, pays off. The challenge is finding that sweet spot, something that gets results and is fair to everyone.
We keep coming back to that issue of fairness, don't we? How do you balance this urgent need to do something with the reality that some countries, well, they've made a bigger mess than others, and how do you make sure developing countries aren't getting a raw deal in the process?
You've hit on some of the toughest questions facing, well, the entire world right now. There's this growing understanding that any solution, it has to put climate justice front and center.
Right.
And that means thinking beyond just emissions. It means dealing with the social and economic imbalances that climate change just makes worse.
So it's not about who's to blame for the past. It's about who's most at risk right now and in the years to come.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more complex. Even within countries, the impact of climate change, it's not a level playing field. It's the people who are already struggling, the ones who contributed the least to this problem. They're the ones getting hit the hardest.
Which turns climate change from an environmental issue into a social justice issue.
100%. And it reminds us that there are no easy answers. We can't fix climate change without tackling things like poverty, inequality, and access to basic resources. They're all connected.
Wow, it's a lot to process.
What?
But you mentioned earlier that there are some experts proposing new solutions. What are some of those ideas?
Some are saying we need a total system reboot, get rid of this whole economic model we have that's hooked on fossil fuels and, let's be honest, often screws over the environment and marginalized communities. They're pushing for something different, something that's actually sustainable and fair, where well-being matters more than just, consuming more and more stuff.
So less about getting more about sharing what we already have.
Yeah, rethinking our relationship with the planet, with each other. It's a big ask.
Yeah, no kidding. Overhauling the entire global economic system isn't exactly a walk in the park. What about some shorter-term solutions? I noticed you highlighted some articles about green technology, the whole innovation angle.
Oh, now that's exciting. We're talking about some really cool stuff.
So things like, solar panels and electric cars, even plant-based burgers. That's what's going to make a difference in this fight against climate change. I mean, I don't know, it's kind of hard to picture those things replacing our reliance on fossil fuels completely. But hey, at least it's a start, right?
It's easy to be cynical, right? To look at those things as just like a drop in the bucket. But think about it. Big changes, they usually start small. And the really cool thing is these technologies, they're getting cheaper, more accessible every day.
True. I remember when solar panels were for rich people. Now I see them everywhere I look.
Yeah.
What about governments? Don't they have a role in making these technologies more, mainstream?
Huge role. Look at things like carbon pricing. You make companies pay for the greenhouse gases they're pumping out. Suddenly, investing in cleaner tech starts looking like a pretty good business decision. Or governments can subsidize renewable energy, give tax breaks, level the playing field a bit, make green options more appealing.
So governments setting those ambitious targets is one thing, but they also need to put their money where their mouth is, support the development, the actual rollout of these technologies.
Exactly. And let's not forget about working together globally, sharing what we know, the technology, the resources. If we're going to crack this thing, it's got to be a team effort.
You've definitely given me a lot to digest here. There's no magic bullet, is there? No single answer to this climate change dilemma. It's about a million different things all coming together, from what we do every day to those big international agreements, tech breakthroughs, political will. It's a lot.
Well said. It really highlights how interconnected this all is. We can't just point fingers. It's about realizing how urgent this is and coming together to find solutions, ones that actually work and are fair to everyone.
So where does that leave us? I think it's safe to say, after this deep dive, that this whole climate change, global responsibility thing, it's complicated, it's multifaceted, and honestly a little overwhelming. But I also think it's safe to say that there's hope.
Oh, absolutely. There are so many people out there, businesses, policymakers, who are done with the talking. They're ready to roll up their sleeves and get to work. And sure, the road ahead, bumpy, no question. But that destination, a healthier planet, a more sustainable world, one that's more just, totally worth fighting for.
Couldn't agree more. And to everyone listening, if this got your wheels turning, don't stop now. Go check out those articles, see what other perspectives are out there. Most importantly, think about what you can do. What role do you want to play in creating a better future?
Because at the end of the day, the solutions, they're not going to come from some big announcement. They're going to come from us, from collective action, innovation, and a shared commitment to, well, saving our planet for ourselves and everyone who comes after us.
Well said. And on that note, time to resurface from this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and hey, thanks for joining us.